Dr. Malcolm Reeves stood in the corridor of Mercy General Hospital, his right hand resting calmly at his side. To anyone watching, he looked like a man waiting for a colleague, but beneath his palm, pressed flat against his skin, was a substance so lethal it could stop a human heart in under 4 minutes. He had waited 11 years for this moment. 11 years of building, planning, suffering in silence. And today, Admiral Frank Gates would finally pay for what he had done to everything Malcolm Reeves had ever loved. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The hallway on the 4th floor of Mercy General Hospital smelled like antiseptic and fresh paint. It was the kind of smell that usually made people anxious. The sharp, clinical scent that reminded you of illness and uncertainty. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late October, Admiral Frank Gates didn't notice the smell at all. He didn't notice the squeaking of the orderly's cart 3 doors down. He didn't notice the fluorescent light above room 412 that had been flickering for 3 days. He noticed nothing except the sound of his own heart, pounding so hard inside his chest that he could feel it in his throat. "She's beautiful, Frank." That was what the nurse had said when she met him at the elevator. Just those 3 words. "She's beautiful, Frank." And Admiral Frank Gates, a man who had stared down enemy fire in 4 different countries, who had given orders that sent other men into harm's way, who had sat across from foreign generals and never once blinked, felt his knees go weak. He was going to be a father. After everything, after all of it, he was finally actually going to be a father. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Hooper, was walking half a step behind him, carrying a small bouquet of yellow roses because Gates had grabbed the first thing he saw at the hospital gift shop downstairs. Yellow. Sarah had always said yellow was for cowards or for sunshine. She'd laugh when she saw them. Gates was counting on that. "Sir, you're walking fast," Hooper said. "I'm not walking fast enough," Gates said without turning around. The corridor stretched ahead of him, about 40 feet to room 418, where his wife Sarah had been for the last 6 hours. He could already see the number on the door from where he stood. 40 feet, 38, 35. And then he saw the man standing outside the room next door. Dr. Malcolm Reeves was wearing his white coat. His hospital ID badge was clipped to the breast pocket. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a prop in a play. He looked completely unremarkable, completely appropriate in the setting. The kind of man your eyes slide right past without registering. Medium height, graying hair at the temples, reading something on a clipboard. Gates barely glanced at him. Why would he? This was a hospital. There were doctors everywhere. 20 feet now. "Admiral Gates?" The man looked up from the clipboard with a practiced smile. "What a coincidence. I wanted to welcome you to our facility personally. I'm Dr. Malcolm Reeves, Chief Executive Officer here at Mercy General." Gates slowed. Politeness was reflex at his rank. You stopped. You extended your hand. You said something appropriate. Even now, even with his heart hammering and Sarah 40 feet away, the 27 years of protocol kicked in automatically. "Doctor," he said, shifting the roses to his left hand, reaching out with his right. And that was the moment. That was the exact moment that nurse Leora Bennett, 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds, came through the stairwell door at the end of the corridor. She wasn't supposed to be on this floor. Her shift was on the 2nd floor, in the cardiac step-down unit. She had come up to the 4th floor to return a pulse oximeter she'd borrowed from the supply room 2 days ago and forgotten about. A small errand. A 2-minute detour on her lunch break. She pushed open the stairwell door, and the smell hit her like a wall. It was faint. Most people would not have detected it at all. Most people would have registered nothing. Maybe a vague chemical undertone that their brains would have immediately filed under hospital smell and moved on. But Leora Bennett was not most people. For 4 years before she became a hospital nurse, she had worked as part of a classified government unit dedicated to chemical and biological threat response. She had spent hundreds of hours in training environments, learning to identify the molecular signatures of compounds that most humans would never encounter in their lifetimes. She knew this smell. She knew it the way you know the smell of your mother's kitchen, or the cologne your father wore when you were 7 years old. It was immediate, and it was absolute, and it detonated something in her nervous system that she had not felt in 6 years. Novichok derivative, Class A nerve agent, contact transfer, lethal within minutes. Her brain processed this in approximately 1.5 seconds. In the second and a half that followed, she saw the Admiral's hand moving forward. She saw the doctor's right hand rising to meet it, and she understood exactly what was about to happen, with a clarity so cold and so complete that it wiped out every other thought in her head. She ran. Not a jog, not a hurried walk. She ran, full sprint, down the corridor, white sneakers slapping the linoleum, her heart going from resting to maximum in about 3 strides. Hooper saw her first. "Hey, slow down, you can't." She didn't hear the rest of his sentence. She was already at Gates, and her right arm was already swinging, and she put everything she had into it, every pound of her body weight shifting forward into the punch. And she caught Admiral Frank Gates square on the left cheekbone. The sound was loud enough that the orderly 3 rooms down dropped his cart. Gates went sideways into the wall. The yellow roses hit the floor. Hooper grabbed Leora from behind, both arms around her, lifting her off the ground. Reeves stumbled back 2 steps, his expression shifting from composed to something else, something flickering and confused and furious. "What in the— Get her off!" Hooper was shouting. "Security! Security now!" Leora was not fighting Hooper. She was watching Reeves's right hand, and she was shouting, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Do not let him touch anyone. Do not let that man touch anyone. His right hand. His right hand. Do not touch his right hand." Gates was against the wall, pressing his fingers to his cheekbone, blinking at her with an expression she would later describe as the most confused she had ever seen on a human face. His cheek was already reddening. He said very quietly, "What in the hell?" "Sir, do not reach out to him," Leora said. She was still in Hooper's grip, but she had stopped struggling. Her voice had changed. It had gone from panicked to precise, the way a person's voice changes when they shift from reaction to command. "I need everyone to listen to me right now. I am Nurse Leora Bennett. I am on staff at this hospital, and I am telling you that there is a contact transfer chemical agent on Dr. Reeves's right palm. If you had shaken his hand, sir, you would be dead in under 4 minutes." The corridor went absolutely silent. Then everyone started talking at once. Hooper was on his radio. 2 nurses who had appeared in doorways were backing away. A patient in a gown who had come out to see the commotion turned and shuffled back into his room quickly. And Dr. Malcolm Reeves stood in the middle of all of it and said nothing. His face had gone carefully, deliberately blank, the way a man's face goes blank when he knows the next words he speaks will be the most important of his life. "This woman is clearly having some kind of episode," he said. His voice was even, professional. He had practiced this, Leora realized. He had practiced the contingency. "I suggest someone calls psychiatric services." "Admiral, I'm so sorry you've been subjected to this. I'll personally ensure this staff member is escorted." "Don't move." The voice came from the other end of the corridor. It was security, 2 of them responding to Hooper's call, one of them with his hand already moving toward his radio. "Sir, stay where you are. Ma'am, stop struggling." "I'm not struggling," Leora said. "I'm asking someone to call for a hazmat kit and not let that man touch anything in this building." Gates pushed himself off the wall. His cheek was swelling. He looked at Leora for a long moment, this small woman in scrubs that Hooper was holding off the ground, and something in his face shifted. 27 years in the military teaches you something about the way people react under pressure. There are two kinds of panic. There is the panic that comes from fear, from confusion, from overwhelm. And there is the panic that comes from someone who knows something you don't know and is desperately trying to make you understand it before it's too late. This woman was the second kind. "Put her down," Gates said to Hooper. "Sir, she just—" "Put her down, Daniel." Hooper set Leora on her feet slowly, not releasing her arms. Gates looked at Reeves. "Don't move," he said. Then he looked at Leora. "Talk." "The compound on his palm is a Novichok derivative," she said. She was breathing hard, but her voice was steady. "It's been modified for contact transfer through skin. The smell is faint, but it's there. I worked chemical threat response for the federal government for 4 years. I'm not guessing. I know this smell." She held his gaze. "Sir, I know what I'm asking you to believe right now sounds impossible. I know how this looks, but if there is any part of you that thinks there is even a 1% chance I'm telling the truth, please do not let that man leave this hallway." Reeves took a step toward the elevator. "Stop him!" Leora's voice cracked. Hooper moved without being ordered, stepping in front of Reeves before the doctor had taken a second step. Reeves looked at him, and for just a fraction of a second, the composed mask slipped. His eyes were wrong. They were too flat, too controlled, the eyes of a man who had rehearsed calmness rather than feeling it. "This is an outrage," Reeves said. "I am the chief executive of this hospital. You are detaining me based on the delusion of a nurse who apparently—" "What hand do you write with?" Gates asked. Reeves blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "What hand do you write with?" A pause. Small, but there. "My left." "Then why is your right hand in your coat pocket?" The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight to it. This one pressed against everyone in the corridor like something physical. Reeves did not answer. Gates turned to the security team. "I need this floor locked down. I need hazmat response. I need gloves on everyone, and I need this man restrained without skin contact, using sleeves or fabric, whatever you have available. Now." He spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had given orders in the dark, underwater, under fire, orders that people followed without hesitation because the alternative was unthinkable. "And someone tell me where my wife is." "Room 418, sir," Leora said quietly. "She's safe. She's been safely delivered, and she's stable, and the baby is healthy. The nurse who met you at the elevator would have checked before coming down. Your wife is safe." Gates looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not military, not command, not protocol. It was something much older and much simpler than any of that. It was gratitude so raw it had not yet hardened into anything expressible. He nodded once. Then he turned back to the situation in front of him. The next 12 minutes were controlled chaos. Hooper had the FBI on the phone before the hazmat team arrived. Hospital security had sealed the 4th floor. 2 nurses had established a perimeter around Reeves, using a supply cart and a wheeled IV stand, like the world's most improvised containment barrier. Reeves stood in the center of it, very still now, watching everything with those flat eyes, saying nothing. Leora was sitting against the wall near the stairwell door. One of the security guards had told her to stay put, and she had, not because she was told to, but because her legs had started shaking after the adrenaline began to clear. She pressed her palms against the cool linoleum and breathed. A hand appeared in front of her face. Yellow rose. She looked up. Gates was crouching in front of her, holding out one of the roses from the bunch he had dropped. His left cheek was swollen. His eyes were red at the corners, which she suspected had nothing to do with her punch and everything to do with the baby girl waiting for him 40 feet away. "I owe you an explanation," Leora said. "You owe me nothing," he said. "I hit you. You saved my life." "You don't know that yet. The tests will confirm what you already know," he said. "I've been in situations where information was sparse, and decisions had to be made before the evidence was complete. You made a decision. I'm standing here. He pressed the rose gently into her hand. My name is Frank. I know who you are, Admiral. Frank, he said again, at least until the FBI gets here and everything becomes formal. He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his eyes because his eyes were full of something else entirely. A kind of stunned reckoning. A man recalibrating in real time what he thought the day was going to be. Leora, she said. Leora Bennett. He nodded. Then he straightened and looked down the corridor to where his aide was standing outside room 418, holding the door slightly open, waiting. I need a few minutes, Gates said to no one in particular, and to her specifically. Will you be all right? Go, she said. Go meet your daughter. He went. Leora watched him push open the door to 418 and disappear inside. She heard, faintly, through the closed door, a sound she would think about for a long time afterward. A man's voice broken open. Not words, just sound. The sound of someone finally arriving somewhere they had been trying to reach for a decade. She looked down at the yellow rose in her hand. Down the corridor, the hazmat team had arrived and was suiting up with practiced efficiency. A technician in a protective suit approached Reeves with a chemical swab kit, and Reeves stood very still while they worked, and his face had gone from carefully blank to something else now, something that looked almost like relief, as if the waiting, the years and years of waiting and building and carrying this weight was over. As if the outcome no longer mattered. That was the thing about people consumed by revenge, Leora had learned. The revenge was never really about the result. It was about the obsession. And when the obsession was finally exposed, even in failure, there was a kind of terrible release. The swab test took 4 minutes. The technician held the result up to the light and turned to the security supervisor and said 3 words. Positive. Highly toxic. The corridor erupted again. Hooper was on the phone, speaking in short, rapid sentences. The security supervisor was calling for additional personnel. A nurse who had been watching from a doorway pressed her hand over her mouth. Leora leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A text from a colleague downstairs. Where are you? Your break ended 10 minutes ago. Everything okay? She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, I'll explain when I get down. Everything is fine. She looked at the rose. She thought about the moment she had pushed through that stairwell door. The fraction of a second between smelling what she smelled and understanding what it meant. The decision that had not felt like a decision at all, that had felt more like gravity, like falling towards something unavoidable. People always asked, afterward, how you know. In a moment like that, when everything is happening at once, and the stakes are higher than your brain can actually process, how do you know? And the honest answer was always the same. You don't know. You act on what you have, with what you know, in the time you have to act. And afterward, the knowing and the not knowing collapse into each other, and what you're left with is simply what happened. She had hit an admiral in the face, in a hospital hallway, on her lunch break. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and laughed. It was not a laugh of humor. It was the laugh that comes when the body needs to release something that does not have another shape. The hazmat technician crouched down in front of her. Nurse Bennett? He had kind eyes above his face shield. We're going to need to do a precautionary scan on you since you were in close proximity. Are you experiencing any symptoms? Tingling? Dizziness? Difficulty breathing? No, she said. None of those. Good, that's good. He made a note on his tablet. Can you walk with me over to the staging area? Yes. She started to get up and then stopped. The Admiral, he never completed the handshake. He's safe, right? Based on what we're seeing, yes. No contact was made. You interrupted before any transfer occurred. He paused. We're going to want a full statement from you, a very detailed one. She looked at Reeves, who was now being secured by two security officers, his hands contained in specialized bags the hazmat team had produced from their kit. He was looking at her, not with the flat emptiness of before, but with something focused and particular. It was not anger. She wasn't sure what it was. Something complicated and long and exhausted. She looked away. "I'll give you everything," she said to the technician. "Whatever you need." She stood up. She smoothed her scrubs. She looked down the corridor once more at the door to room 418, behind which an Admiral was meeting his daughter for the first time. While outside in the hallway, the machinery of consequence was assembling itself around the man who had tried to make sure that meeting never happened. Leora Bennett tucked the yellow rose carefully behind the handle of a supply cart so it wouldn't get trampled, and she walked toward the hazmat staging area, steady and quiet, carrying the weight of what she knew and what she had done and what it meant, carrying all of it exactly the way she had always carried things, without making a sound about it, without asking for anything in return, without understanding yet, not even slightly, how completely and irrevocably the next 24 hours were about to change her life. The hazmat staging area was nothing more than a cleared section of the fourth-floor corridor. A folding table, two equipment cases, and a containment protocol that the technicians executed with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained for worst-case scenarios and were now living inside one. Leora sat in a folding chair while a technician named Rodriguez ran a calibrated sensor across her hands, her forearms, the front of her scrubs. She watched the numbers on his device without blinking. "Clean," he said after the third pass. "You're clean." She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. Her hands were still shaking slightly, just at the fingertips, the kind of tremor that happens after a body has flooded itself with adrenaline and then been told to stand down. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Across the corridor, Dr. Malcolm Reeves was being secured against the wall by two security officers who were following hazmat protocols to the letter. No skin contact, hands contained, a physical distance maintained that felt both clinical and deeply surreal. He had not spoken again since the swab results came back positive. He simply stood there, watching the controlled chaos around him with an expression that Leora could not stop reading, even though she kept trying to look away. It was not the face of a man who had been caught. It was the face of a man who had been interrupted. There was a difference, and it unsettled her more than she could articulate. Rodriguez closed his equipment case. "FBI is going to want that statement soon," he said. "You feel up to it?" "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." He gave her the look that medical professionals give each other when someone says they're fine, in a tone that means anything but. She ignored it. Lieutenant Commander Hooper appeared at her left, a little breathless, his radio still in his hand. He had the look of a man who had spent the last 15 minutes making calls that would not appear in any public record. He pulled up a chair without asking and sat down close enough that he could keep his voice low. "Nurse Bennett." He said her name like he was filing it somewhere important. "I need to ask you something before the Bureau gets here and this becomes a formal process." "Ask. How certain are you about the compound?" She looked at him steadily. "I identified it by scent in under 2 seconds from approximately 30 feet away. The swab confirmed it." "How certain do you need me to be?" Hooper rubbed his jaw. He was not a man easily rattled, she could tell that much. But he was rattled now, working to keep it underneath the surface. "What I mean is, do you have any idea what class of agent we're talking about? Specifically, Novichok derivative, likely 4th generation, modified for cutaneous absorption. Whoever synthesized it knew what they were doing." She paused. "It wasn't something he mixed in a bathtub. That compound requires access, resources, and knowledge that does not come cheap or easy. Someone helped him." Hooper was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to need to tell the FBI exactly that, word for word." "I plan to." He stood, hesitated, then looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. For what it's worth, what you did out there was... He stopped himself, cleared his throat. The Admiral has a daughter, 4 hours old. He was never supposed to make it to that room. His voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough. He pressed his lips together and walked away. Leora looked down at her hands. 4 hours old, a girl who had no idea and would not know for many years how close her first day on Earth had come to being the day she lost her father. Down the corridor, the door to room 418 was still closed. She thought about Sarah Gates. She had passed that room twice during her unauthorized trip to the fourth-floor supply cabinet, and she had heard, very faintly, the sound of a newborn crying, that thin, furious, absolutely specific sound that never sounds like anything else in the world. Sarah Gates had just delivered her first child after 10 years and 2 miscarriages, and a husband whose career had kept him thousands of miles from every significant moment of that struggle. And now that husband was inside that room with her, and the reason he was alive to be there was standing 40 feet away in a folding chair, trying to stop her hands from shaking. Leora pressed her palms together and laced her fingers. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and 3 people stepped out who were unmistakably FBI. Not because of what they were wearing, though the suits helped, but because of how they moved. Deliberate, coordinated, reading the room in pieces as they entered it, eyes cataloging, posture controlled. The one in front was a woman, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, and she swept the corridor once with her gaze before it landed on Leora and stayed there. She crossed to her without greeting anyone else first. "Nurse Bennett," it was not a question. "I'm Special Agent Diana Cho. I need everything you have." "Okay," Leora said. "Starting from the moment you entered this floor," Leora told her. "All of it. The supply run, the stairwell door, the smell, the recognition, the calculation, the sprint." She was precise. She did not editorialize. She had been trained to give information under pressure, and she fell back into that training now, the way a person falls back into a language they learned young, the muscle memory of it deeper than conscious thought. Cho listened without interrupting. Her 2 colleagues were moving toward Reeves, badges out, voices low. Leora watched Reeves's face as they approached. Still nothing. Still that unsettling stillness. "The compound," Cho said when Leora finished. "You called it a Novichok derivative, 4th generation. Modified for contact transfer, yes. Not something available through any legitimate channel." "No." Cho looked at her for a long moment, not suspiciously, assessingly. "Your background, you said Federal Chemical Threat Response." 4 years. I left the unit in 2018. "Why?" The question was clean and direct, and Leora had known it was coming. "Personal reasons. I'll answer that fully whenever you need me to. Right now, I want to make sure you understand something about the compound." She leaned forward slightly. "The modification that makes it absorb through skin contact, rather than requiring inhalation or injection, that is not a standard formulation. It requires specialized synthesis equipment and a very specific knowledge base." "Doctor, Reeves is a hospital administrator. He has an MD, and he ran a department for 12 years before becoming CEO. But this compound is beyond his technical capacity. Someone built it for him. And whoever built it has access to materials and knowledge that should be on your radar as a national security issue, not just a criminal one." Cho had stopped writing. She was looking at Leora with an expression that was harder to read now, something that was moving between professional interest and something more urgent. "You know this for certain." "I know enough chemistry to know the gap between what Dr. Reeves could produce independently and what was on his hand tonight. That gap is significant. Fill it." Cho closed her notebook, opened it again, wrote 3 words and underlined them twice. She turned slightly and caught one of her colleagues with a look that communicated something specific and compressed. the shorthand of people who work together closely in high-stakes environments. He nodded once and stepped away with his phone. Leora exhaled. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Do you have a file on Reeves already? Before tonight?" The pause was brief, but it was there. "What makes you ask that?" "Because the way you reacted when I mentioned the synthesis gap, you weren't surprised. You were confirming something." Cho looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. Then she said, "That's not something I'm able to address right now." Which was, Leora understood, its own kind of answer. Down the corridor, the interaction between Reeves and the two FBI agents had shifted. One of them was speaking to him in that low, formal cadence of a formal arrest proceeding, and Reeves was listening with his eyes closed. Not in distress, with his eyes closed the way a person closes their eyes when they have finally put down something that was very, very heavy. He opened them when the agent stopped talking, and he said, clearly enough that Leora could hear it from where she sat, "I want to speak to whoever is in charge." "That would be me," Cho said without raising her voice or turning around. Reeves looked past the two agents standing in front of him, directly at Cho. Then his gaze moved, slowly and deliberately, to Leora, and he said, "I want to explain." "You'll have the opportunity to explain in a formal setting with your attorney present," Cho said. "Not to you," Reeves said. His voice was different now. The professional smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was rougher, older, and unexpectedly human. He was still looking at Leora. To her. The corridor went still again. That particular quality of stillness that Leora was starting to recognize as the signature of this situation. The way every new revelation in the last 40 minutes had created a fresh silence, each one heavier than the last. "Why?" Leora said, before Cho could redirect. Reeves's jaw tightened. "Because you're the only person here who changed anything. Everyone else in this building today was following a script. You weren't." He took a breath. "I want you to understand what he did. Before they take me out of here, before this becomes a headline, I want one person who was actually present to know why." "That is not going to happen right now," Cho said firmly, stepping forward. "No," Leora said. Cho stopped. "Not now," Leora said to Reeves. "But I'll listen. At the right time, in the right setting, I'll listen to everything." She held his gaze. "That's not a promise of sympathy. I'm not in a position to give you that. But if what you did connects to something bigger, something that matters beyond this hallway, then someone needs to hear it clearly. I'll be that person." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that might have been, in another life, in a different context, gratitude. Then he nodded once, slowly, and looked away. Cho turned to Leora with an expression that said several things simultaneously, all of them professional, and none of them what she was actually thinking. "We'll talk more in a moment," she said quietly. "I know," Leora said. It was another 20 minutes before the formal FBI processing of the scene was underway, and the fourth floor had been subdivided into a series of contained zones that each served a specific investigative purpose. The hospital's senior administrator on duty, a harried-looking man named Gary Shields, who had been pulled from a budget meeting by the lockdown alarm, was standing near the nurses' station, trying to understand what had happened to his facility and visibly failing. "Someone needs to explain to me," he said to no one in particular, "how a hazmat event and a federal criminal proceeding both occurred on my fourth floor before noon on a Tuesday." Nobody answered him. Leora's colleague from the second floor, a nurse named Priya, who had texted her earlier about the lunch break, appeared at the elevator with a concerned expression and was immediately stopped by security. She craned her neck until she spotted Leora, and her expression shifted from concerned to something much more intense. "Leora," she said it like a punctuation mark, "what did you do?" "I'll explain later," Leora said. "Security just told me you punched an Admiral." "I'll explain later, Priya. Was he okay? Are you okay? Why are there hazmat people? Why is there an FBI agent on our..." Priya, Leora looked at her directly. I promise I will explain everything. Please go back downstairs. I'm fine. Priya opened her mouth, closed it, looked around the corridor one more time with wide eyes, and retreated to the elevator, turning to look back twice before the doors closed. Leora pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where her heart was still running slightly faster than normal. She thought about what Reeves had said, what he did. Not what I planned, what he did. The pronoun carried something in it, a specific weight that told you this was not a random act, and it was not a spontaneous one. This was the terminal point of something that had been building for a very long time. She was thinking about that when the door to room 418 opened. Admiral Frank Gates stepped into the corridor. He looked nothing like the man who had walked toward her 40 minutes ago. He was still the same physical person, still tall, still in uniform, still with a swollen cheekbone that was going to be noticeably purple by tomorrow. But something had happened to his face that had nothing to do with her punch. He looked like a man who had been cracked open and then carefully, gently reassembled, softened at the edges, heavier in a way that was not burden, but ballast. The specific gravity of someone who had just become a father. He saw Leora and walked directly to her. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, and she could see that he had been crying, recently, the kind of crying that happens when a person is so full of something that the body just makes the decision without consulting the mind. He didn't seem embarrassed by it. He just looked at her. She has her mother's eyes, he said. Leora felt something move in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. That's a good thing, she said. The best thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sarah wants to meet you. Leora blinked. Sir, she knows what happened. I told her as much as I knew. He glanced toward the FBI team processing Reeves. She heard the commotion from her room. The nurses tried to keep her calm, but Sarah has never been particularly cooperative with that. A ghost of a smile. She asked me, when I came in, whether I was all right, and I said yes. And she said, Who got you? Because she knows me, and she could see the cheek, and she knew that someone had hit me, and she wanted to know who. And I told her a nurse named Leora Bennett had saved my life. And the first thing she said was, he stopped. His jaw worked. The first thing she said was, Go get her, bring her in here, right now. Leora stood up slowly. Her legs were steadier now. I don't want to intrude on. You are not intruding, he said. You are the reason there is a moment to intrude upon. She followed him to the door of room 418. He pushed it open and held it for her, and she stepped inside, and there was Sarah Gates, propped against pillows, hair damp, face the particular beautiful exhaustion of a woman who had just done the hardest and most extraordinary thing a human body can do. She was holding a bundle of pale pink hospital blanket in her arms, and she looked up when Leora entered, and her eyes were exactly the color Gates had implied they would be, brown and warm, and right now so full of feeling that Leora had to steady herself. You're Leora, Sarah said. Yes, ma'am. Come here. She said it simply and directly, with the authority of a woman who had earned the right to give that particular instruction in this particular room on this particular day. Leora crossed to the bedside. She looked down at the baby, who was asleep, mouth slightly open, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. She was, objectively, the smallest and most complete thing Leora had seen in a long time. Her name is Grace, Sarah said. Leora did not trust her voice for a moment. When she found it, she said, That's a perfect name. Sarah reached out with her free hand and took Leora's, not gently but firmly, the grip of a woman making a point. I've been lying in this room for 6 hours, terrified about whether Frank was going to get here in time, whether everything was going to be okay, whether after everything we went through to get to this moment, something was going to go wrong at the last possible second. Her voice was steady, but her hand was tight around Leora's. And something almost did, but you were there. Her eyes were wet, but she did not look away. You were there. Leora opened her mouth to say something measured and professional about doing her job and being in the right place. All the things you were supposed to say when someone looked at you with that much gratitude and you didn't know what to do with it. But she looked at Sarah Gates holding her daughter Grace, and at Frank Gates standing in the doorway of his own life with tears he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. And she said nothing at all. She just held Sarah's hand and let the moment be what it was. Outside the room, the sound of the FBI processing a man who had nearly committed murder filled the corridor with the machinery of consequence. Voices, radios, the specific cadence of formal proceedings, all of it just beyond the door, all of it belonging to a different register of this day. Inside room 18, Grace Gates slept on, unknowing and complete, breathing the small, steady breaths of someone who had just arrived and had absolutely no plans to leave. And Leora Bennett, who had walked up to the 4th floor to return a borrowed piece of equipment on her lunch break, who had punched an Admiral in the face in front of witnesses, who had spent the last hour sitting in a folding chair answering questions about classified training she had not spoken about in 6 years, stood at a bedside and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with chemistry or threat assessment or any kind of training at all, that she had not simply interrupted a murder today. She had changed the entire shape of what came next. For a family, for a man, for a baby girl named Grace who was breathing quietly in her mother's arms. She just didn't know yet how much it was going to change the shape of her own life too. And in the corridor, behind the closed door, Malcolm Reeves was finally beginning to talk. Malcolm Reeves began talking at 12 minutes past noon, sitting in a secured room on the 3rd floor that the hospital used for administrative meetings, and that the FBI had requisitioned in under 4 minutes once it became clear the 4th floor corridor was not a viable interrogation environment. Special Agent Diana Cho sat across from him. A second agent, a quiet man named Ferris, who had said almost nothing since arriving, sat to her left with a recorder and a legal pad. Reeves had waived his right to wait for an attorney with a calm that suggested he had considered this moment very carefully and made his peace with what it required. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Cho, and he said, 11 years ago, Admiral Frank Gates authorized a military operation that killed my son. The room did not react. Cho was trained not to react. Ferris kept writing. But the air in the room shifted in a way that all 3 of them felt. His name was Daniel, Reeves said. He was 23 years old. He had been deployed for 14 months. He called me the night before the operation and told me he had a feeling about it. Not fear exactly. He said it felt wrong. He said the intelligence had gaps, and the timeline had been compressed, and the men running the briefing weren't answering questions the way they should have been. Reeves's voice was completely level. He was not performing grief. He was reporting it the way a doctor reports a diagnosis, with the precise, terrible neutrality of someone who has lived with a thing so long it has calcified into fact. I told him to trust his commanding officers. I told him that the system had safeguards. I told him that the people making those decisions had information he didn't have access to. He paused. I told him I was proud of him. Those were the last words I said to my son. I told him I was proud of him, and I hung up the phone. Cho said nothing. The operation failed within the first 20 minutes, Reeves continued. Faulty intelligence, a compromised asset. 11 men went in, 3 came out. Daniel was not one of the 3. He looked at his hands on the table. The official report cited unavoidable battlefield conditions. The inquiry that followed was internal and classified and produced no findings of command negligence. Admiral Gates, who had approved the operation over the documented objections of 2 senior analysts, received a commendation 6 weeks later. Cho leaned forward slightly. Mr. Reeves, I understand what you're describing. I want you to understand that what you are telling me now does not exist in a legal vacuum. Anything you say... I know what I'm saying, Reeves said. I'm not confused about my situation. I did what I did. The compound on my hand was real. My intention was real. I am not going to pretend otherwise." He looked at her directly. "But you are going to want to hear the rest of what I have to tell you, because what I planned to do today was the smallest part of an 11-year investigation that your agency, Agent Cho, should have conducted and did not." The silence that followed that sentence was a different quality entirely. Ferris stopped writing. Cho said very carefully, "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that Daniel was not the only one," Reeves said, "and Gates was not the only architect." Upstairs in room 418, Leora was still sitting with Sarah and Grace when Hooper appeared in the doorway with an expression that told her the situation had developed in a direction nobody had anticipated. He caught her eye with the specific look of a man who needed to speak to someone and could not do it in front of a woman holding a newborn. She gave Sarah's hand a final squeeze, said something quiet about checking back later, and slipped out into the corridor. Hooper was already walking. She matched his pace. "Reeves is talking," he said, low and fast. "Not confessing in the traditional sense. He's giving information, substantial information, and Agent Cho wants you in the room." Leora stopped walking. "Why me?" Hooper stopped too, turned to face her. "Because he asked for you specifically. He said he'd give Cho the full picture, but he wants you present. He said, and I'm quoting here, that you're the only person in this building who acted on truth today, and he trusts your presence to keep him honest." She stared at him. "That doesn't make any legal sense." "I know. I'm a nurse. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not—" "I know," Hooper said again. "Cho knows. She cleared it anyway. You'll be an observer, not a participant. You don't ask questions. You don't respond to anything he says. You sit in the corner and you listen. But she wants you there because Reeves appears to be more forthcoming when he believes someone in the room is present as a witness to truth rather than a collector of prosecutable statements. And right now the information he's offering is more valuable than standard procedure." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to go." Leora thought about the way Reeves had looked at her in the corridor, not with the eyes of a man who had failed, with the eyes of a man who needed one person to understand something before the system absorbed him completely and translated everything into legal language and procedural categories that would strip it of whatever human reality it contained. "I'll go," she said. The room was smaller than she expected. Reeves looked up when she entered, and something in his posture changed, not relaxing exactly, but settling, the way a person settles when they have been waiting for something to arrive. She took the chair in the corner that Cho indicated without a word, and she sat down and she folded her hands in her lap, and she listened. Reeves looked at her for one moment. Then he turned back to Cho, and he continued. "After Daniel died, I spent 2 years trying to find out what actually happened through legitimate channels. FOIA requests, congressional inquiries through my representative, a private attorney who specialized in military accountability cases. Every avenue closed, every request denied, classified, redacted, not subject to disclosure." His voice stayed even, but his hands on the table had tightened slightly, the knuckles shifting. "In the 3rd year, I started finding things on my own. I had resources. I had money, and I had the particular obsessive focus of a man who had nothing left to lose and one remaining purpose. And what I found, piece by piece, over the course of 7 years, was not simply that Gates had made a bad call that cost my son his life. What I found was a pattern." Cho said, "Define pattern." 14 operations over 9 years, all authorized by Gates either directly or through his chain of command, all resulting in casualties that exceeded projected parameters significantly, all followed by classified reviews that produced no findings of negligence, all connected at varying degrees of separation to defense contracts that benefited a network of private military contractors with documented connections to a lobbying organization that Gates has received financial support from since 2015. He paused. My son was not a casualty of bad luck. He was a casualty of a system that had been deliberately constructed to make certain decisions and then shield the people who made them from consequence. Gates was not the only architect, but he was the most visible one, and he was the one I could reach. The recorder on the table was running. Cho's face was unreadable. Leora sat in the corner and felt something cold moving through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You have documentation, Cho said. It was not a question. Extensive documentation. 14 months of financial records, operational timelines, contractor relationships, and 2 source testimonials from individuals who were present at planning stages of 3 of the 14 operations. He looked at her with those exhausted, flat eyes. It's in a secure location. I will tell you where it is and give you complete access on one condition. You're not in a position to set conditions, Mr. Reeves. You're right, he said quietly. But I'm going to ask anyway, because what I'm about to give you is not just my son's story. It's the story of 47 men who went into situations they shouldn't have survived and didn't. 47 families. And if this documentation disappears into a classified review, the way every other inquiry has, those 47 men will have died for nothing twice. Once in the field and once in the bureaucracy. His voice cracked, very slightly, for the first time. I'm asking you to promise me this does not get buried. The room was completely silent. Leora looked at the wall. Her jaw was tight. She was doing exactly what Cho had told her to do, staying still, staying quiet, being a witness to truth without inserting herself into it. But her hands in her lap were no longer folded. They were pressed flat against her thighs, and she was pressing down, hard. Cho said, I can't make you a promise about outcomes, Mr. Reeves. What I can tell you is that what you're describing, if documented to the standard you're claiming, constitutes a matter of significant national interest and would not be processed through standard channels. She paused. That's the most honest thing I can offer you. Reeves looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. He gave her the name of a storage facility in Northern Virginia, a unit number, an access code. Ferris was already on his phone before the access code finished leaving Reeves's mouth. Outside the room, in the corridor, something was happening that none of them were aware of yet. Lieutenant Commander Hooper had taken a call from a number he did not recognize, a call that lasted 45 seconds, after which he stood very still for a long moment and then walked quickly to the stairwell and made 3 outgoing calls in rapid succession. His face during those calls was the face of a man receiving information that was reorganizing his understanding of the day in real time. Inside the room, Reeves was still talking. The contractor organization I mentioned, he said, the one with documented financial connections to Gates. I need you to understand what it actually is, because the name it operates under publicly is not what it operates as. It is listed as a defense consulting firm. It consults on nothing. It is a procurement intermediary. It facilitates the movement of contracts, intelligence products, and in at least 3 documented cases, personnel, between military decision-makers and private interests in a way that is structured specifically to avoid the oversight mechanisms that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of arrangement. Cho said, You're describing a conspiracy. I'm describing what's in the documents, Reeves said. Call it what the evidence supports. Have you shared this documentation with anyone else? Media? Other government contacts? No. Why not? The question sat in the air between them. Reeves looked at his hands again. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. Something older had come to the surface. Something that chose procedural detachment and Leora's careful stillness both failed to insulate either of them from. It was grief, simple and total, the kind that has burned so long it has gone all the way through rage and obsession, and come out the other side as something that barely resembles a feeling anymore and is just the shape of what a person becomes when they have carried a loss that long. Because I didn't want justice, he said. I wanted him to die the way my son died. Suddenly, without warning, with no time to prepare. I wanted Frank Gates to be walking towards something he thought was good, something he had been waiting for, and then have it taken from him in a moment, the way Daniel was taken. He exhaled slowly. I wanted him to know, in the last 4 minutes of his life, what it felt like. Nobody spoke. I know, Reeves said into the silence. I know what I became. He glanced at Leora for the first time since she had entered the room. That's why I needed her to hear this. Not because she'll forgive it, but because she was there. She saw me. Not the hospital CEO, not the file. Me. He looked back at Cho. Whatever I was before this, it started with a phone call from my son, who told me something was wrong, and I told him to trust the system. I have to live with that. Whatever happens to me now, that's the thing I have to live with. Leora looked at the wall. Her eyes were burning, and she was absolutely not going to cry in this room, and she breathed steadily through her nose and held herself together by sheer force of the same discipline that had gotten her down a corridor and into a decision in under 2 seconds that morning. Cho closed her notepad, opened it, made a note, closed it again. We're going to take a short break, she said. Mr. Reeves, can I get you anything? No. Then after a pause, water, please. Cho stood, nodded to Ferris, and looked at Leora. They stepped into the corridor together. The door clicked shut behind them. Cho said nothing for a moment. She looked at the ceiling the way a person looks at the ceiling when they are processing something that does not fit neatly into any existing category. Then she looked at Leora. Are you all right? Yes, Leora said. That was a significant amount of information to absorb. I'm fine, Leora said. Then, because Cho had been honest with her and it seemed like the appropriate response to that, she said, I don't know yet. I'll know later. Cho almost smiled. That's a better answer. She lowered her voice. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this corridor. The storage unit he described in Virginia. Our team in DC confirmed the unit exists and is registered under a subsidiary company name that is already on a watch list for reasons unrelated to this case, which means the documentation Reeves is describing, if it's there, is going to open something considerably larger than an assassination attempt on a naval admiral. Leora absorbed this. How large? Large enough that I'm going to need to make calls to people who outrank me significantly before we proceed with anything. Cho looked at her with an expression that was direct and without artifice, and large enough that your role in this, today, in this hallway, is not simply going to be logged as the intervention of a quick-thinking nurse. You stop something. You stop the part everyone could see, but the part nobody could see, the documentation, the network, the 47 men Reeves mentioned. None of that comes to light today if Reeves dies in this corridor as he planned. He talks because he failed, and he failed because of you. Leora thought about the stairwell door, the smell, the calculation, the sprint. I returned a pulse oximeter, she said. Cho looked at her. That's what I came up here for, a borrowed pulse oximeter. She said it not as a joke, but as a fact she needed to hold on to for reasons she could not entirely articulate. The specific smallness of the errand, the specific enormous weight of what the errand had interrupted. The distance between those two things was something she could not yet measure and was not sure she wanted to. Cho's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression shifted, fast and controlled, but it shifted. She looked up at Leora. The team in Virginia is at the storage unit. And? Cho looked at her phone again. Then she looked at the door to the room where Malcolm Reeves was sitting with his water and his grief and his 11 years. It's there, she said quietly. All of it, exactly as he described. She pressed her phone to her chest and looked at the ceiling again. Everything he said is there. The weight of that moved through the corridor like something physical. Leora pressed her back against the wall, and she thought about Daniel Reeves, 23 years old, calling his father the night before an operation, to say something felt wrong. She thought about Frank Gates in room 418, holding a baby girl named Grace. She thought about 47 men and 47 families, and the architecture of a system that had been carefully constructed to absorb them without consequence. And she thought about a smell, faint, chemical, specific, the smell that had detonated in her nose when she pushed through a stairwell door on her lunch break, and everything that had come from that single moment of recognition. Cho was already on her phone, walking down the corridor, her voice dropping to that particular register of a person in conversation with someone whose rank requires it. Ferris appeared from the room with his own phone and his own expression and his own conversation that needed to happen immediately. Leora stood alone in the corridor. From somewhere above her, she could hear, faintly, the sound she had heard before through the door of room 418. That specific sound. A newborn, thin and furious and completely, utterly alive. She closed her eyes. She had been a nurse for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 4 years in a unit whose purpose was to stand between ordinary life and the things that wanted to end it. She had left that unit because the weight of knowing what she knew and living in the ordinary world with that knowledge had become something she could not continue to carry in the way the job required. She had thought that becoming a nurse was a way of keeping the useful part and setting down the rest, the vigilance without the stakes. She understood, standing in this corridor on the 3rd floor of Mercy General Hospital, that the stakes had followed her, that they had been waiting, patient and quiet, for a moment like this one, for a stairwell door and an errand, and a smell that cut through 6 years of ordinary life like a key finding a lock. She opened her eyes. Down the corridor, Cho was still on the phone, her back to Leora, her free hand moving in the controlled, precise gestures of someone making very specific points to someone who needed to receive them clearly. Leora straightened. She smoothed her scrubs. She looked at her hands, which had finally stopped shaking. Then she heard Hooper's voice from the far end of the corridor, moving fast, speaking urgently, and she looked up and she saw his face. And she understood immediately that whatever had just been established in the room with Reeves and in the storage unit in Virginia was not, in fact, the largest thing that was happening today. Something else was. Something that had just found its way to this building. And it was moving toward all of them right now. Hooper was not a man who moved without purpose. In the 4 hours Leora had known him, she had observed that everything he did was measured, deliberate, the physical expression of a mind that processed before it acted. So when he came down the 3rd floor corridor at something close to a run, his radio in one hand and his phone in the other, and his face stripped of every layer of military composure he had maintained since the moment she punched his Admiral in the cheekbone, Leora felt her stomach drop before he said a single word. Cho turned from her phone call. She read Hooper's face the same way Leora did, with the same immediate recalibration, and she said something brief into her phone and ended the call. Hooper reached them both and stopped. He was breathing controlled but fast. "We have a secondary situation," he said. "Define secondary," Cho said. "There are 2 men in the hospital. They came in through the emergency entrance 40 minutes ago. Separate entry points, 3 minutes apart, which means they didn't come together, but they coordinated. Security flagged them because one of them asked a nurse at the ER desk which floor the maternity ward was on. And when she told him visiting hours were restricted, he left without pushing, which is not how a family member behaves." He looked at Cho directly. "They're still in the building. Security has eyes on one of them near the 2nd floor stairwell. The other one dropped off camera near radiology 7 minutes ago." The silence lasted approximately 1 second. Cho was already on her radio. "I need a full building lockdown. All entry and exit points right now. Code 4, do not announce over hospital intercom." She looked at Hooper. "Who sent them?" "We don't know yet." "Best guess." Hooper's jaw tightened. "Reeves spent 11 years building a case against a network. A network does not become a network without people in it who have significant resources and significant motivation to protect themselves. If even one person in that network knew Reeves was planning today, or if someone in that network has been monitoring this situation since the lockdown hit the police scanner this morning, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Leora looked at the door to the interrogation room where Reeves was sitting with his water and his documentation and the most dangerous information in this building. Then she looked up the corridor toward the stairwell. Her mind was doing the thing it used to do in the unit, the fast triage calculation. Threats in positions and variables, running faster than conscious thought, producing outputs before she had fully registered the inputs. "They're not here for Reeves," she said. Both Cho and Hooper looked at her. If they wanted to silence Reeves, they had 40 minutes to find him, and they haven't moved. He's in a room on the 3rd floor that is not hard to locate. They haven't gone to him. She kept her voice low and even. "They're here for the Admiral. Reeves failing doesn't protect the network. Gates still surviving is the problem. Reeves talking is a secondary problem that they may not even know about yet. But Gates walking out of this hospital alive, that they know about. It's been on the scanner. It's been a known fact for at least an hour." She looked at Cho. "They're going to the 4th floor." Cho did not waste time confirming or debating. She turned and spoke rapidly into her radio, redirecting 2 agents to the 4th floor stairwells and 2 more to the elevator banks. Then she looked at Leora with an expression that was not comfortable but was completely direct. "You need to stay on this floor, in this corridor. You do not move from this position." "My patient," Leora started, "is surrounded by federal agents as of 30 seconds ago," Cho said. "Stay here." She was already moving, Hooper falling into step beside her, both of them accelerating toward the stairwell at the end of the corridor. Leora stood alone again. The corridor was quiet in the particular way that institutional spaces go quiet during emergencies. Not empty, not absent of activity, but holding its breath, the ambient sounds of the building still present, but somehow muffled, as if the building itself was listening. She counted to 5. Then she went to the stairwell. She told herself it was because she needed to know. She told herself it was professional. She told herself a number of things in the 6 seconds it took her to cross the corridor and push through the door, none of which were entirely honest, and all of which were partially true. The honest reason was simpler and less defensible. She had been part of this from the moment she smelled something in a hallway and made a decision. And she was not constitutionally capable of standing in a corridor while the consequences of that decision played out above her without knowing what was happening. The stairwell was clear. She went up 1 floor. She did not open the 4th floor door. She pressed herself against the wall beside it and listened. She could hear voices on the other side, multiple voices, controlled but urgent, the specific overlapping cadence of people coordinating under pressure. She recognized Cho's voice. She recognized the tone of Hooper's responses. She did not hear anything that sounded like a confrontation. Then she heard a voice she did not recognize say, very clearly, through the door, "He's not here. The floor is clear. We missed him." A pause. Then Cho. "He was on camera at the 2nd floor stairwell 6 minutes ago. He didn't come up here. Go back down." Leora processed this. If the man security had tracked was not on the 4th floor and had not come to the 3rd floor and had been near the 2nd floor stairwell, then the 2nd floor was the variable. The cardiac step-down unit was on the 2nd floor, her floor, the floor where she was known, the floor where anyone who had done basic research on the events of this morning would know that the nurse involved worked. The thought arrived with the cold specificity of a diagnosis. They weren't just here for Gates. They had broadened the target. She was moving back down the stairwell before she had fully completed the thought, taking the stairs fast and quiet, not running, controlled, the way she had been trained to move in situations where speed and silence were both required. She pushed through the 2nd floor door and stepped into the corridor of the cardiac step-down unit and looked both ways. Priya was at the nurse's station, back turned, updating a chart. Two other nurses were in the medication room. The corridor was otherwise quiet, the particular mid-afternoon lull that the second floor always had between the end of morning rounds and the start of afternoon vitals. A man was standing near the water fountain at the far end of the corridor. He was not a patient. He was not in scrubs. He was dressed in the generic civilian clothing of someone who had considered not being noticed and had done a reasonable job of it. Dark pants, a gray jacket, the kind of appearance that asked your eyes to slide past it. He was looking at his phone. He was between Leora and the stairwell she had just come through. She did not look at him directly. She turned and walked to the nurse's station as if she had not seen him, as if she was simply returning from a break, her pace unhurried, her body language completely ordinary. She reached the station and picked up a chart and opened it without looking at the page. "Priya," she said quietly, without lifting her eyes from the chart. "Where have you been?" Priya said, still writing. "Do you have any idea what's happening on the fourth floor? Security has been—" "Priya," Leora's voice was quiet and absolutely level. "Don't turn around. Don't look toward the water fountain. Call security right now, not the hospital extension. Call 911. Tell them there is a potential threat on the second floor of Mercy General. Tell them you need officers here immediately. Do it from the medication room where he can't see you." Priya went very still. She was a smart woman. She had been a nurse for 11 years, and she had worked 2 hospitals in neighborhoods where reading a situation quickly was a professional skill that overlapped with a survival skill. She did not question. She did not turn around. She set her pen down, picked up her phone, and walked into the medication room at a pace that was just fast enough to be purposeful and just slow enough to be invisible. Leora kept her eyes on the chart. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, moving up the corridor in her direction. She did not turn. She calculated the distance by sound. 20 feet. 15. She turned a page in the chart she was not reading. "Excuse me." The voice was behind her left shoulder. She turned, expression neutral, the face of a nurse interrupted during charting. The man was close. Closer than the social convention of a hallway allowed for. Close enough to be a specific kind of statement. He was mid-40s, unremarkable face, but his eyes were doing the thing that Leora recognized from 4 years of working with people who dealt in violence. They were cataloging. They were checking her hands, her pockets, the space around her. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was completely steady. "I'm looking for a nurse. Leora Bennett? I was told she works on this floor." The specific chill of hearing your own name in a situation like this was something Leora had been trained for and had never fully gotten used to. She held her expression in place by main force. "I don't know who that is," she said. "What's this regarding? If you're looking for a specific staff member, you'd need to go through the main information desk on the ground floor. Visitors aren't supposed to be on this floor without clearance." He looked at her for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to communicate that he knew she was lying, and she knew that he knew, and they were both choosing to continue the performance for their own separate reasons. Then he said, "My mistake," and stepped back. He turned and walked toward the stairwell. Leora waited 4 seconds. Then she said, "Hey," loudly enough that it carried. He stopped, turned. "The information desk," she said, "is that way." She pointed toward the elevator at the opposite end of the corridor. He looked at her hand pointing at the elevator. Then he looked at her face. Something moved behind his eyes that she had seen before in training scenarios. The recalculation of a person who has just realized the situation has more variables than they accounted for. He looked at the stairwell door. He looked at the elevator. He made a decision. He went for the stairwell, and the door opened from the other side before he reached it. The FBI agent who came through it first was the same quiet man named Ferris who had been in the interrogation room with Cho. He had his badge out and his other hand at his hip, and his voice was the professional, flat command register of someone delivering instructions that were not optional. Behind him were two hospital security officers who had clearly been briefed and positioned and were now executing a plan that Cho had put in place from the fourth floor. The man in the gray jacket stopped with 3 feet between himself and Ferris and looked at the badge and made his own calculation in the space of about 2 seconds. Then his shoulders came down slightly, the specific physical signature of a person choosing not to escalate, not because they were not capable of it, but because the math had stopped working in their favor. "Hands," Ferris said. The man complied. Leora sat down on the edge of the nurse's station desk because her legs had made the decision for her, and she had learned enough this morning to let them. She pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed. Priya appeared from the medication room and looked at the scene at the end of the corridor, and then at Leora, and opened her mouth and closed it again. "Are you all right?" Priya said finally. "Yes," Leora said. Then, honestly, "I don't know. Maybe." Priya sat down next to her, not saying anything, not asking anything, just sitting there, which was the right thing, and Priya had always known what the right thing was, even when she didn't know why it was. Cho appeared through the stairwell door 40 seconds later. She looked at the detained man. She looked at Leora. Something moved through her face that was not standard FBI composure, and she let it sit there for a moment before she controlled it. "I told you to stay on the 3rd floor," she said to Leora. "I heard something in the stairwell." "You heard something. Concerning something." Cho looked at her for a long moment. "The second man was picked up near radiology 4 minutes ago by local PD who were already en route. They're both connected to a private security firm with documented ties to 3 of the contractor relationships in Reeves's documentation." She paused. "They weren't here for Gates. We were wrong about that. Initial assessment suggests they were here to make sure Reeves didn't leave this building in a position to testify." She glanced at the man Ferris was securing at the end of the corridor. "And when word got out that a nurse had been the one to intervene this morning, and that nurse was still in the building, the calculus may have expanded." Leora absorbed this quietly. The calculus had expanded. A clean, administrative way to say that she had become a target by virtue of being the person who had made the first domino fall. "Is Gates safe?" she asked. "Yes, his family is safe. Room 418 has had 2 agents outside the door since the lockdown." Cho's voice had shifted slightly. "You didn't ask about yourself first." "I already knew I was safe. You wouldn't be standing here having this conversation otherwise." Cho looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated in a way she didn't try to simplify. "We need to move you," she said, "not a request. You are now materially connected to an active federal investigation with national security dimensions, and you cannot continue functioning as a floor nurse in this building as if this morning was a contained incident. I need you in a secure location where we can complete your statement and where your physical safety can be guaranteed while we work out what the next 24 hours look like." Leora looked at the corridor, her corridor, the one she had worked for 3 years, the medication room and the chart rack and the call board, and Priya sitting beside her with the steady, uncomplicated presence of a person who showed up. She thought about her patients on this floor. The man in room 204 who had been asking every shift whether he could have real coffee yet. The woman in 211 who was going home tomorrow and had been so quietly terrified that Leora had spent 20 minutes sitting with her the night before, just talking about nothing. The ordinary, essential, irreplaceable texture of the work she had come to this hospital to do. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "Leora, 10 minutes to hand off my patients properly, to make sure whoever takes my charts knows what they need to know. That's not negotiable." She looked at Cho directly. "I'm not a soldier. I'm a nurse. I will walk out of this building with you and go wherever you need me to go and tell you everything I know for as long as it takes. But I'm going to do it after I take care of my patients." Cho held her gaze. Then she said, 8 minutes. 10, Leora said. Another pause. "Fine." Leora stood up. She looked at Priya, who had been listening to this with the expression of a person watching a film they cannot pause. "I need you to cover the rest of my shift," she said. "I'll explain everything later, I promise." "You keep saying that," Priya said, "and I keep meaning it." Priya looked at her, really looked at her, the way a person looks when they are trying to take a reading of something that is not on any chart. Then she said, "Are you okay? Not in the way you're going to tell the FBI you're okay, actually." Leora thought about that. She thought about the stairwell door and the smell and the sprint and the punch and the interrogation room and Reeves's voice saying, "I told him I was proud of him." And she thought about Grace Gates breathing small, furious breaths in her mother's arms. And she thought about standing in the second-floor corridor, holding an open chart she wasn't reading, while a man who might have been there to kill her stood 6 feet behind her left shoulder. "I will be," she said. "That's the most honest thing I can give you right now." Priya nodded. She reached out and put her hand briefly on Leora's arm. "Go," she said. "I've got the floor." The next 8 minutes were the most deliberately ordinary 8 minutes of Leora's day. She moved from room to room with Priya at her side, transferring care, flagging the things that needed flagging, being completely and fully present for the human beings who were in her charge, and who had no idea what had happened on the floor above them, or in the corridor outside, or in a storage unit in Northern Virginia. She checked Mrs. Ellison's drainage output and confirmed with the overnight chart that Mr. Thatcher's blood pressure had been stable for 16 hours, and she answered a question from room 208 about pain medication timing with the same attention and patience she brought to every shift. She did not rush. She did not look toward the stairwell. She was a nurse doing her job, and she did it completely, because that was what you did. Cho was waiting at the nurse's station when she finished. She had a look on her face that Leora was beginning to recognize as the particular expression of someone who had been expecting one thing from a person and received something different. Not a lesser thing, just a different one, and was still processing what that meant. "Ready?" Cho said. Leora picked up her badge from the counter. She looked at it for a moment, her name and her photo, and the hospital logo and the blue lanyard she had worn for 3 years. She set it back down. "Yes," she said. They went to the stairwell together. On the ground floor, a car was waiting. 2 more agents Leora had not seen before were already inside. The hospital's front entrance, which had been in controlled lockdown since shortly after noon, was now beginning the process of returning to normal operations. Security teams cycling down, the visible presence of law enforcement that had accumulated over the past 3 hours beginning to thin and redistribute. Leora got into the car. She looked out the window at the front of Mercy General Hospital. At the entrance she had walked through at 6:30 that morning, carrying a coffee she had not finished, and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether she had remembered to set her rent payment to auto-transfer. Cho got in beside her. The door closed. "The documentation in Virginia," Leora said. "The 47 men. What happens to it now?" Cho was looking at her phone. "It goes to a task force, a real one, with oversight and accountability, not another internal review." "You're sure about that?" Cho looked up. "I'm sure that what came out of that storage unit today cannot be managed quietly. Too many people know too much already." She held Leora's gaze. "And I'm sure that the person who made it impossible to manage quietly is sitting next to me." Leora looked out the window again as the car pulled away from the curb. The hospital got smaller behind them. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the specific, patient, terrible weight of a grief that had curdled into purpose, and about all the ways a person can lose themselves so gradually in what they've decided to do that they stop noticing who they were before they decided it. She thought about 47 men and the families they left behind, and the apparatus that had been very carefully constructed to ensure that their deaths remained accountable to no one. She thought about a pulse oximeter. She almost laughed. She pressed her hand over her mouth and did not. The car moved through afternoon traffic. Cho was on her phone again. The two agents in front were quiet and professional, and entirely uninterested in the internal landscape of the woman in the back seat who was trying to understand what the shape of tomorrow would look like, now that today had become what it was. She did not have an answer. She was not sure she was supposed to, yet. What she had was this. Grace Gates was alive. Frank Gates was alive. In a storage unit in Virginia, 47 names had a chance at meaning something that their deaths alone had not been allowed to mean. And somewhere in a secured room inside Mercy General, Malcolm Reeves was sitting with the weight of 11 years in the end of the story he had told himself. And whatever came next for him would not be simple or clean, but it would be true. And truth, however painful, was at least a real thing to stand on. Leora leaned her head back against the seat. Outside, the city moved past the window, ordinary and continuous, and entirely unaware of the day it had just had. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. Nurse Bennett. The voice was Frank Gates, quiet, steady, with something underneath it that she recognized as the particular warmth of a man who did not express gratitude easily and was making the effort anyway. I wanted to call before things get too official and formal, and I lose the chance to say it plainly. She said nothing. She waited. Thank you, he said, for my daughter, for my wife, for the yellow rose. A pause, and for the bruise on my cheekbone, which I am going to have to explain for the next 2 weeks. She did laugh this time, short and real and completely unplanned. You're welcome, Admiral, she said. All of it. The car kept moving. The city kept going. And somewhere behind her, in a hospital on a Tuesday in October, a woman named Grace, 4 hours and 40 minutes old, breathed in and breathed out, small and complete, and entirely unaware of everything that had been spent to put her here, in this life, with this chance. The FBI field office on the 14th floor of a federal building, 12 blocks from Mercy General, was not the kind of place that made people feel comfortable, and it was not designed to. The lighting was fluorescent and flat. The chairs were functional in the way that communicated that sitting in them for extended periods was not something you were meant to do without purpose. Leora had been sitting in one for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and she had given her full statement twice, once informally with Cho, and once formally on record with a second agent who asked the same questions in a different sequence and wrote down her answers with the careful deliberateness of someone building something that would need to hold weight for a long time. She had told them everything. Her time in the Chemical Threat Response Unit, the specific training protocol that had taught her to identify compounds by molecular scent signature, the names of her supervisors, the clearance level she had held, the reason she had left. She told that part plainly and without decoration. Her partner of 4 years, a man named Thomas who had worked in the same unit, had died during a training exercise when a containment protocol failed. Not in the field, in a training room. And she had left because she could not continue doing work that felt, after that, like it had taken something from her that it had no right to take and given nothing back. The agent writing her statement did not react to this. He wrote it down the same way he wrote everything else. She was grateful for that. Cho came back into the room at 6:47 in the evening, carrying 2 coffees in paper cups and an expression that had shifted from the controlled urgency of the afternoon into something more complex, more tired, and more human. She set a cup in front of Leora and sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the table for a moment before she looked up. The 2 men apprehended at the hospital, she said. They're talking. Leora curled her hands around the coffee. What are they saying? They were contracted through a shell company that traces back 3 layers to a name that is on the operational documentation from Reeves's storage unit. A man named Victor Haas. He is currently a senior partner at a defense consulting firm in McLean, Virginia, and he has been for the last 9 years, the central node in the contractor network that Reeves spent 11 years documenting. Cho paused. He was also the person who originally proposed the operation that killed Daniel Reeves, the one that Gates authorized. Leora set her cup down. He sent those men today. We believe so. The working theory is that Haas had someone monitoring police and hospital communications. Standard protective surveillance for someone with that level of exposure. And when the incident at Mercy General hit the scanner this morning, his team identified it as a potential unraveling event and moved to contain it. Cho's voice was even, but her jaw was tight. What they did not account for was how quickly Reeves would decide to cooperate. Or that the documentation existed at all, Leora said. Or that, Cho took a breath. Victor Haas was placed under federal arrest at his office in McLean at 5:15 this evening. He is currently in custody. His firm's records have been seized under a warrant that was issued in under 2 hours, which is, I want you to understand, not how warrants normally move. The documentation from the storage unit accelerated every part of this process by a significant margin. She looked at Leora directly. When I said this morning that you stopped something larger than what anyone could see, I want you to understand that I meant that with complete precision. Leora was quiet for a moment. She thought about Haas sitting in a McLean office this morning while two men moved through a hospital toward targets he had identified remotely, casually, as a containment measure. She thought about the distance between that office and room 418, the geography of power and consequence, how far a decision could travel, and how small and specific the point at which it could be interrupted. A pulse oximeter, a stairwell door, a smell. What about Gates? She said. The Admiral has been fully briefed. He and his family were moved to a secure location this afternoon as a precaution. His legal team and the Navy's Judge Advocate General's office are in contact with our task force. Cho's expression shifted slightly, something moving underneath the professional surface. I will tell you honestly that what the documentation reveals about the operational decisions connected to Gates is going to be a significant and complicated process to work through. There are questions about what he knew, what he authorized, and what he was told that have no clean or quick answers. Some of what Reeves believed about Gates may be entirely accurate. Some of it may be more complicated than Reeves knew. That's for the process to determine. She paused. But the man who tried to kill him today did so for reasons that are now, at least, on the record. And the people who built the system that created those reasons are no longer operating in the dark. Leora nodded slowly. And Reeves? Cho was quiet for a moment. He is being processed. He will face serious charges. There is no version of this where what he did does not carry legal consequence. But his cooperation has been substantial, and the information he provided has already triggered actions that would have taken years through normal investigative channels, if they had happened at all. She held Leora's gaze. I told him this afternoon that I could not promise outcomes. I can tell you now that the documentation will be seen by the right people. That I can promise. Leora thought about Reeves's face in the interrogation room. The exhaustion behind the flat eyes. The voice saying, I told him I was proud of him, and hung up the phone. She thought about 11 years of carrying a thing that had no legitimate outlet, and what it does to the architecture of a person, how it reshapes everything around the central wound until the wound becomes the structure, and the structure becomes the person, and you cannot tell anymore where the grief ends and the man begins. She did not excuse what he had done. She was not capable of excusing it, but she understood something about it that she would not have understood before today. Before 3 hours in an interrogation room, watching a man dismantle himself piece by piece in the service of a truth that had outlasted everything else he had. Okay, she said. Cho looked at her. Okay? I'm done for today, Leora said. Whatever else needs to happen, I will do it. I will answer every question, appear wherever you need me, give whatever testimony is required. But I'm done for tonight. I need to go home. Cho nodded once. A car will take you. There will be an agent stationed outside your building until we assess the threat picture over the next 48 hours. Is that necessary? Yes. Leora picked up her coffee. She drank the rest of it even though it had gone cold. She stood up, and for the first time since the stairwell door that morning, she felt the full weight of the day settle into her body, her shoulders, her legs, the specific gravity of hours that had contained more than hours were supposed to contain. She pressed her hands against the small of her back and straightened. One more thing, Cho said. She reached into the folder on the table and slid a single sheet of paper across to Leora. This came through about an hour ago. I was asked to deliver it in person. Leora looked at the paper. It was a letter printed on official Navy stationery, signed at the bottom in handwriting that was heavy and decisive, the penmanship of a man who had signed important documents for a long time. She read it without sitting back down. It was brief, 7 sentences. The first acknowledged that she had intervened in a situation that had saved his life. The second stated that the Navy and the Department of Defense were aware of her background and her service in the Chemical Threat Response Unit. The third said that those agencies were, in his words, embarrassed that her skills had been lost to the private sector for the reasons they had been lost. The fourth was a formal notification that an inquiry into the training incident that had taken Thomas Riley's life had been reopened under a new oversight structure. The fifth said that this had been authorized before today, but that today had moved it to the top of the priority list. The sixth said that she did not need to do anything and that she did not owe the Navy anything. And the seventh said that if she ever wanted to talk, his personal number was at the bottom of the page and she could call it at any time and he would answer. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her scrubs, over her heart, which was the only place that felt appropriate for it. She walked out of the FBI field office at 7:22 in the evening. The car was waiting. She had not let herself think about him directly in a long time, had built habits and routines around the edges of that particular absence to keep it contained, to keep it from flooding the parts of her life that needed to function. But tonight she let herself think about him completely. The way he had laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. The way he had been meticulous about every piece of equipment in the unit and chaotic about everything in his personal life. The way he had smelled of coffee and industrial soap and the specific chemical neutralizer they all used after training sessions. The way he had been, on the morning of the exercise that killed him, absolutely certain that the day was going to be routine. She pressed her hand against the letter in her pocket. The inquiry had been reopened, not because of her, not because she had asked, because a man who was alive today when he should have been dead had used the power of being alive to look backward at the shape of the system and found a fault line that had always been there and had never been properly examined. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know if it would produce answers or if it would produce more silence dressed in different language. But it was open. It was moving. And movement, she had learned in a long time of keeping still, was the beginning of everything. The car stopped outside her building. She thanked the driver. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the night air and looked at the ordinary front of the ordinary building where she lived her ordinary life. And she felt the gap between this and this morning with a vividness that was almost physical. The person who had walked out of this building at 6:15 with an unfinished coffee and no particular sense that the day would be anything other than a Thursday felt very close and very far away simultaneously. She went upstairs. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. Coffee cup on the counter, jacket on the hook. A book she had been reading for 3 weeks, face down on the arm of the couch. She stood in the middle of her living room and looked at all of it, the specificity of her own life, and she thought about what Cho had said in the car, the person who made it impossible to manage quietly. She did not feel like that person. She felt like herself, tired and a little raw and carrying too much that had not yet been processed. She felt like a woman who had punched a Navy admiral and spent the day inside a story that was much larger than any single person was supposed to be inside of. Her phone rang. She looked at it. It was a number she did not know. She answered. Miss Bennett, the voice was female, brisk, professional, with a particular cadence of someone who is accustomed to calls being taken seriously immediately. My name is Carolyn Marsh. I am the Deputy Secretary for Health Infrastructure Policy at the Department of Health and Human Services. I apologize for the hour. I'm calling because I've been briefed on the events at Mercy General today, and specifically on your background and your actions, and I would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Leora sat down on the couch. Can I ask what this is regarding? Of course. A brief pause, the pause of someone organizing a significant thing into compact language. We have been working for 2 years on a framework for what we're calling enhanced sensory threat detection in healthcare environments. The premise is straightforward. The existing security protocols in American hospitals are designed primarily for physical threat response. They are not designed for chemical threat identification at the point of contact level. Today's event demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that this gap is real and that it has life or death consequences. Another pause. What you did today, Miss Bennett, is something that no existing hospital protocol trained you to do. You did it because of prior expertise that you brought into a civilian healthcare setting and applied in real time. What we are trying to build is a protocol that institutionalizes that capacity. That puts it into the system so that the outcome of today does not require a specific nurse with a specific history to have taken a specific errand on a specific floor at a specific moment. Her voice was direct. I would like to talk to you about what that could look like, and I would like you to be part of building it. Leora was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the face-down book on the arm of the couch. She thought about Priya saying, "You keep saying that," and meaning it. She thought about Mrs. Ellison's drainage chart and Mr. Thatcher's blood pressure, and the woman in room 211 who was going home tomorrow and had been quietly terrified. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the unit and the years of training and the knowledge she had carried out of that life and into this one, like something she had not known what to do with. Something she had spent 6 years being careful not to use too fully, because using it fully meant acknowledging what it had cost her to have it. She thought about a stairwell door. "I'm listening," she said. Carolyn Marsh talked for 15 minutes. She talked about the framework and the funding and the pilot programs that were already in early planning stages. She talked about the gap between existing hospital security protocol and the kind of threat that today had represented. She talked about a network of institutions that were already in conversation about implementation. And then she said something that landed differently than everything else, quietly and without dramatic emphasis, the way the most significant things often arrived. "We've been calling it a working title so far," she said, "but the team has been informally referring to the framework as the Bennett Protocol. After today, I don't think it's going to stay informal." Leora pressed her hand against the letter in her pocket. She said, "When would we meet?" 3 days later, she was back in Mercy General, not on her floor, the 4th floor. She had been asked to come, not by hospital administration, not by the FBI, but by a text message from a number she had saved in her phone under the name Frank. It said simply, "Sarah wants to say goodbye before we take Grace home. Room 418, 11 o'clock if you can." She could. Sarah Gates was dressed and sitting on the edge of the bed, Grace in a car seat carrier on the floor, bundled in a pale yellow blanket that Leora noticed with a feeling she could not name was exactly the color of the roses that had been dropped on this floor 3 days ago. Frank was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, and the purple yellow of a healing bruise on his left cheekbone, which he had explained to the Navy as a gym incident with a confidence that Sarah had told Leora in the first 30 seconds of her arrival, was deeply unconvincing. "He has a terrible poker face," Sarah said. "He always has. I knew within 6 hours of meeting him that he was completely incapable of sustaining a fiction. That's a generous interpretation, Gates said, of what was actually a very smooth story. You told the base commander you walked into a door. I did walk into a door, the door of a difficult situation. Leora laughed, and it was easy and real, and came from a place that had not been accessible 3 days ago. She crouched down and looked at Grace, who was awake, doing the specific, unfocused looking of a 4-day-old. Eyes moving without landing, taking in the world at a resolution that was still calibrating. She had her mother's eyes, Frank had said. He was right, brown and warm and present. She's beautiful, Leora said. She said it the way the nurse had said it to Gates in the elevator 4 days ago, simply, because it was simply true. She is, Sarah said. Her voice was soft and full, and without any of the edges that the past 4 days had put into it. She looked at Leora with the steady warmth of a woman who had decided exactly how she felt and was not interested in dressing it in any more or less than what it was. I want you to know something. Frank told me everything about Reeves and about what he told the FBI and about the 47 men and about the things that are being opened up now that couldn't be opened before. She paused. I don't know how to account for all of that. I don't know how to hold all of it at the same time. But I know that I would have been lying in this room alone when Grace came home, and the person she was waiting to meet would not have been here. And you changed that. Her eyes were bright, but she did not look away. She's going to know your name. From the time she can understand language, she is going to know who Leora Bennett is. I am making you that promise. Leora stood up slowly. She looked at Sarah. She looked at Frank, who was watching her with the expression she had come to understand over the past 4 days as his version of everything he did not have the words for. She looked at Grace in her yellow blanket, 4 days into a life she had no idea had been fought for before it had barely begun. She thought about what it meant to be known, not as a file or a protocol or a case study or a headline, to be known by name, by a person, as the thing you actually were. To have someone make a promise to remember you, not abstractly, but in the living, specific way of a child growing up with a story about a woman who had once stood in a hallway and made a decision. She did not have a speech for this. She had not prepared one. She had not known she would need one. Take good care of her, she said. Her voice was steady and quiet and completely meant. Both of you, all three of you. Gates stepped forward and extended his hand, not the way he had extended it 4 days ago in this same corridor, reflexively, as an act of protocol. Deliberately, looking at her while he did it, making the choice visible. She took it. His grip was firm and warm and held for a moment longer than a handshake required. I'm going to say this once, he said, and then I'm going to spend a significant amount of time making it true rather than just saying it. He held her gaze. Whatever you need, whatever the next chapter of your life requires, you have my word that I will do everything in my power to make it possible. She believed him, not because he was an admiral, not because of rank or protocol or the machinery of obligation, because she had seen his face in a hospital corridor when he thought he might not get to meet his daughter, and she had seen his face when he did, and she knew that a man who felt things that completely did not make promises he did not intend to keep. She walked out of Mercy General at 11:47 that morning, the same entrance she had walked through at 6:30 on Tuesday, the same automatic doors, the same antiseptic smell hitting the cooler air outside, the same ordinary city moving around the building without any awareness of what had happened inside it. She stood on the sidewalk. She looked at her hands, steady, both of them completely steady. 6 weeks later, Leora Bennett stood at a podium in a conference room at the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C., in front of 43 hospital administrators, federal health officials, and security specialists from 12 states. She had notes on the podium that she did not look at. She spoke for 22 minutes about the gap in hospital security infrastructure, about chemical threat identification at the clinical level, about the difference between responding to violence and detecting it before it completes itself. She spoke about what training could look like and what implementation would require and what it would cost in time and resources and institutional commitment. She spoke about a Tuesday morning in October when none of it existed and a life was saved anyway. Not by a system, but by one person who happened to be standing in the right place with the right knowledge and the willingness to act on it in the time she had. And then she said, "The goal of the Bennett Protocol is to make sure that the next time it doesn't have to be one person standing in the right place. The goal is to make every place the right place." When she sat down, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Carolyn Marsh started clapping, and the rest of the room followed. And Leora sat in the sound of it and did not look at the ceiling or at her notes or at the far wall. She looked at her hands in her lap, folded and still and no longer shaking, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about a yellow rose behind the handle of a supply cart, and she thought about a baby girl breathing small, furious breaths in a pale yellow blanket, alive and arriving and completely, permanently here. She had walked up to the 4th floor of a hospital to return a borrowed piece of equipment. She had come back down carrying everything else, and she had spent every day since making sure that what she was carrying did not stay only hers, that it moved outward into the world in the shape of something useful, something that protected people, something that paid forward the cost of every lesson that had been paid for in the hardest possible currency. Leora Bennett had not saved Frank Gates's life by being extraordinary. She had saved it by being present, by knowing what she knew, and by refusing to let the moment pass without acting in it. And that, she had decided, was the only definition of courage that had ever made any sense to her. Not the absence of fear, not the performance of bravery, just the decision, made in the time you have with the knowledge you carry, to step forward instead of back. She had made that decision once in a hallway. She was going to spend the rest of her life making it again.